I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
What are we looking at today, Rob?
Today we're looking at the Ballad of Mulan.
Ah, yes, the Ballad of Mulan, which was made into a Disney movie in 1998.
Something like that. Was it 1998?
I think so, yeah.
Which everyone assumes they know, and it was funny, I was talking to a Chinese friend the other day, and we were sort of laughing about the degree to which the story has become part of popular consciousness in China and many other places as well. Mm. And yet if you actually read the original text, or the original text that we have anyway, which is what we'll be talking about today, a little bit different.
Yeah, it's really kind of, I don't want to say strange. I think that it's sort of empowering in some ways for women, and in other ways it's quite problematic in the sort of way that we read this maybe in modern terms. Just before we kind of get discussing the actual poem, you mentioned the original version that we have.
Right.
So the first version was written in the, I think, 6th century CE, in the Common Era, and we don't have that version.
Right.
But this most recent, the version that we are looking at today, that's the most famous version, is from the 12th century. Mm. And it was written in the Song Dynasty. So China, at least partially at this time, was under threat from these northern, quote-unquote, barbarian groups who were pressing down on them and eventually took over the northern half of China and then took over all of China.
Right. So, as with so many texts, for older texts anyway, there is the version that we have, and who knows, it could have been different before, but we're going to have to go with the only one that's left us.
I did read somewhere that the author of the version that we have, whose name is Guo Maoqian, he claimed to be working off the original source. So at least we have this claim of sort of a legitimate passing down. But then I guess the question is, if he's just copying something, then is he really the author?
Why do we even need his copy if he's just copying?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. Clearly there was some sort of change, some sort of translation.
So let's get into some of the specifics.
Yeah, why don't you tell us what actually happens?
So in the poem, and first of all, I want to point this out. This is the first major difference. This is a poem. It's a ballad. Well, the Chinese term for it is not actually ballad. I use the English word ballad because that is the best example I can give of sort of a style of writing that is similar to this.
Okay.
But we think of this as a story, as sort of a narrative. And it is a narrative, but the fact that it's in poetic form means it usually is much shorter and more concise.
This is not a novel. This is not a 1.5 hour Disney story. This is something that takes you, 5 minutes to read. We're going to post our translation on the website. You'll see it. But this is a very short, kind of condensed narrative.
Right.
So, Rob, could you maybe summarize this poem for us?
Yeah, so here's the summary of the action as we have it. So, Mulan's father is called up by the army of the Khan. This would be Khan as in Genghis Khan, only probably not actually Genghis Khan. And he has no son to take his place, and so Mulan does. She goes and equips herself with armor and a horse, rides off to battle, distinguishes herself on the battlefield, gets permission from the emperor to go home, and the probably the last third to a half of the poem is her pining for her home, to be able to serve her parents again, to take off her armor and be a good daughter of her household, and it ends with a very peculiar trio of couplets, which we will talk about. And they're peculiar because they don't really seem to fit. But anyway, that's the whole story as we have it. So let's get into a little bit of this, Lee. What's different here?
So this is different from the kind of popular conception of the story of Mulan in several ways. I guess first off, the thing that struck me was it's not really that much about fighting.
No.
Fighting actually takes up a fairly small portion of this. Twice as much time is spent on describing getting to the battlefield as is described in the battle, even though the battles are kind of these epic things, 100 generals dying, lots of people getting rewarded afterwards, all that kind of, greatness, glory, that sort of thing.
Yeah, in fact, there's only one couplet. There's only one couplet, 2 lines in the whole poem that actually talk about the battlefield. And that reads, in my translation, this way. The northern air rings with the watchman's rattle. The pallid moonlight gleams with steel armor. That's it. There's no records of charging into battle, her hair flying in the wind, or none of that.
So this isn't the Iliad.
This is not the Iliad. This is most wartime epics. And so that's a major difference. Another major difference is that she does not spend the whole poem hoping to distinguish herself in battle and prove that women too can fight, can do what men do.
She actually really doesn't want to distinguish herself in battle, right?
It doesn't say necessarily if she does or not.
She seems very regretful to have to go to battle.
She doesn't want to go do it. And in fact, after the battle is over, she spends most of the second half of the poem pining for home, hoping to go home, and specifically to take
home.
Yeah, to specifically take off her armor and resume her place in the household, taking care of her parents, etc.
At the end of the poem, the emperor, in order to honor her service, does offer her this position, right? Mm-hmm. She could have been a bureaucrat, which was the apex of things that Chinese people wanted.
Yeah, you wanted to be a part of the civil administration.
Now, we should point out that women were not allowed to do this. So it's kind of unclear. I mean, to me, it's unclear on whether or not the emperor knows that Mulan is a girl and not a dude at this point, right?
Right. Yeah, and so what she's actually calling for is the resumption of a traditional spot in the household. She's turning away glory. She's turning away service in the government. She's turning away recognition of her right to serve in the government, even as a woman, in favor of going back home and helping her parents.
Right, which is the traditional role that a woman's supposed to play.
And that's perhaps the biggest problem that a lot of people encounter when they read this after being exposed to the popular version of the story. In the original story that we're reading, she just wants to do her duty and then go home. Mm-hmm. So Lee and I were talking just before this, not assuming that's true, because that is true, can we read this as a poem that empowers women in a traditional culture like this?
So I was reading this book by a scholar named Wang Zheng, and she looks at a lot of different women from kind of the Chinese Enlightenment. So we're talking about the May 4th and the sort of role that these women as feminists played and how they kind of moved from being this traditional Chinese woman or whose parents were traditional Chinese women, and then they became these kind of empowered, problematically so, empowered women in the first half of China's 20th century. And several of these women referred to Mulan as a kind of role model. Specifically, they argued, these women from the May 4th movement argued that what they were doing is, strengthening themselves in order to strengthen the nation. They put it in terms of all of these different kinds of Chinese values. And we should point out the reason that Mulan does this is not because she wants to be a good feminist.
Right.
She is doing this for filiality.
Yes.
And to serve her nation. Or her, I guess, state would be a more correct way.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, though, is that she does this, but she steps into a role that she has no right to occupy. This is
according to a traditional
Confucius. Yes, thank you. According to the traditional Confucian viewpoint, it is the eldest son or the father who serve in battle. So if there is no eldest son, the father's got to go. She steps into this, which is a huge breach of tradition.
But she's doing it to help out her dad.
Yes, but whether or not that would have been seen as okay is kind of up for grabs.
Well, I mean, at least in this poem, and this is written during the Song Dynasty when kind of the new Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism is starting to kind of come about, she is definitely viewed positively. Like,
Right.
what she does is viewed in a good way, right?
Right. And we've talked about this in other... There's lots of other examples in Chinese literature of someone rebelling against a traditional norm, but doing so in a way...
In a very traditional way.
Like, there's a Huabun short story that we have a podcast on called A Male Mencius's Mother
Right.
Saves Her Son. It's a long, complicated title. Male Mencius's Mother.
Yeah.
And it involves a really strange gender-switching episode. And I don't say that as in switching genders is strange, but the way it's done is really strange. But because in the story, the character who does this does so in a thoroughly Confucian fashion, or for Confucian reasons, it muddies the waters a little bit.
Yeah.
And so here you have someone in this story, in the story of Mulan, who's stepping into a role she's not supposed to be in, but she's doing it to serve her father. And isn't that Confucian?
I think you're hitting on the tension that makes this poem such a long-standing, so popular. Is there's this tension between two kinds of Confucian virtues. One Confucian virtue is women should stay in their place,
Right.
not leave the house. We see that she's doing that in the beginning of the poem and at the end of the poem. At the beginning of the poem, it starts out, and I'll just read that first stanza. It's automatopoetic at first, so it's Ji, again, Ji. Mulan facing the door, weaving. You cannot hear the sound of the loom shuttle. You can only hear the daughter's sighs.
Mm-hmm.
So she's there. That Ji sound is the sound of the loom that she's working on. And we should point out, throughout Chinese history, from the Han Dynasty on, good women weave stuff. Like, that's the thing. When you see women weaving, you can know, oh, this is a good woman. There's something going on here. This is a woman who's going to be positively portrayed in terms of femininity. Like, that's the thing that women do. So she starts out and she's doing the thing that women do. And the next stanza, I'm not going to read it out, but it almost sounds like it's saying her brain was empty. She's not thinking about anything. So it's not about her desire to go and do this stuff. That's the sort of Confucian woman should stay inside.
Mm.
So we set up this tension, and in the end, we have that same tension. She is like, I don't want to do any of that dude stuff. I don't want to go serve the government anymore. I'm not doing this to become a great politician or official. I'm doing this just to pay off my father's debt. That's done. I'm out of here. Mic drop.
Yeah. And it is an interesting mic drop because, and I'm gonna
Ancient Chinese mic drop.
Ancient Chinese mic didn't have a mic. What would they have dropped? A scroll? I don't know. That would
Something. Yeah,
that'd be pretty awesome. But I'm going to argue actually that the poem is a very feminist stance. And I say that knowing how problematic a term feminism is because there's just so many approaches to it. But the reason I say this is that Mulan does serve in the army with distinction, is offered a post by the emperor, turns it down, which is a very Confucian thing to do, a good daughter. But the last three couplets...
Hang on, let me just point something out. That is a very unfeminist thing to do.
Yes, that is thoroughly unfeminist. You're offered power, you're offered the chance to take a man's spot, and you go, no, I want my woman's spot.
I just want to be a woman.
Yeah,
I'm just
a traditional woman.
I'm just a stupid girl.
Yeah, and I want to throw this in there just because I feel like I have to put an asterisk or qualify. Lee and I are aware that when we say things like, "This is what a good woman does," people are going to cringe. We're saying this from the stance of
We're speaking as good Confucians.
Good Confucians.
Rob and I are channeling our Confucian.
This is not the stance we hold day
necessarily.
to day. No, but just in the context of the poem,
yes,
I have to clear the air in case that way we don't get hate mail. Like we're aware of how this sounds. And
we will know we are important once we start to get hate mail.
We don't have any hate mail yet.
Please send us hate mail.
Maybe not. Send us fan mail first, but we'll settle for hate mail. Anyway, moving on. Last three couplets in the poem.
So you think this is a feminist?
I do, and I'll tell you why. Because in the last half, she does go home, which you would say is thoroughly not.
She's rejecting any kind of role in power. She's saying, no, that's what guys do.
Yeah.
I did what I wanted to do as a filial daughter, and now I'm going to stop.
Right. So here's the last three couplets. Let me read them so we're on the same page. She goes out the door and sees her comrades. Her comrades are all shocked. Traveling together for 12 years, they didn't know Mulan was a girl. The male rabbit's feet kick up and down. The female rabbit's eyes are bewildered. Two rabbits running close to the ground. How can they tell if I am male or female? So, one of the things that's interesting there is depending on how you translate the last line, it can be how can they tell or how can you tell, because there's not really a specific pronoun. It doesn't say she said to herself or she said to them. So you can translate it either way. Regardless, they're all shocked. She's heading off back home, but her parting thought, or if you translate it this way, her parting words to them,
To her comrades.
yeah, to her comrades, is an interesting analogy or just illustration. You have two rabbits. One is a male, one is a female. They're both running together. And if you see them running, if you see them in the act of doing what they're doing, how can you tell if they're male or female? And the reason this is interesting is because she's not saying, and I'm going to go ahead and change my mind and take up a new post. She's going to go be a good filial daughter. But she's leaving him a parting thought. I served with you for 12 years. You didn't know I was a woman because in the heat of battle, it doesn't matter. And so it's a statement saying, if another woman were to come in the midst of you and fight like me, would you even know? And if you don't know, then what does it matter? Why do these gender differences actually matter?
Yeah, I think that there is something really strange going on with this rabbit thing, partially because, so my wife's a veterinarian, and last I checked, you don't judge a rabbit's gender by its eyes or its feet.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something really weird going on there by this evocation of rabbits' non-sexual body parts. I don't know. I'm not an expert on rabbit keeping in Song Dynasty China, so
right.
we'll leave that.
That could be a good thesis topic.
That could be. It's out there for you, whoever's listening. But it definitely is. She is questioning the kind of naturalization of these gender roles. She's questioning whether me being a chick is something that is just imposed on me by society, or whether it's something that I was born with. And if it's something that I'm born with, then how was I, Mulan, able to go out there and, rumble with the best of y'all?
Right, exactly. And I think that's the interesting point, is that the poet then touches all his bases at the end here. He sends Mulan home to be the good filial daughter, thereby fulfilling the desires of all the traditional readers. But her parting words are, if I was able to pull this off and hoodwinked all of you for 12 years, 12 years is a long time,
yeah.
Right?
Think of how many bathroom breaks you had to hop.
Yeah, you would have had to cover a lot of stuff up.
Yeah.
So she pulled all this off for 12 years, fooled them all, and if that's the case, if in the action of what you're doing, the gender roles don't matter, then do they matter anywhere else?
But we've always got to go back to this. She does go back.
She does go back.
She does go home. She rejects the kind of male position because she's not, for whatever reason, it's actually not really clear. It's not really clear if she doesn't feel like she can do it or she doesn't want to do it.
And that I think is one of the other keys. There's no motivation here. She just goes back. So who knows why? She could literally... This is possibly the disadvantage of a really short poem. Maybe she's just really, really tired.
And it's one of those things, we've mentioned this before, classical Chinese is an incredibly concise language. Oftentimes, writers are not concerned with motives. We've looked at Pu Songling, and we don't have any idea of what people's motives are in his writing of classical Chinese. Here, we don't have any idea of what Mulan's motives are in returning home. But she does return home. She does accept the feminine position. Except when I guess what I would say is that it's not a story, it's not a feminist story because all she's doing is saying that me being a good filial daughter is more important than me accepting these traditional Confucian male-female dichotomous roles.
But one of the things I think we're getting mixed up in is the notion that in order to be a feminist statement in this poem, she has to blow apart all the norms in society and, become a civil bureaucrat, perhaps take over a country, something like that. That's the only avenue for feminist expression in this poem. But one of the perspectives I'm working on is that the poem challenges the capacity to actually know definitively that someone can or cannot do something based on their gender role. In this one, she proves that the most masculine, at least in this period, act, which would be going to war and defending the country, a woman can do as well. And do so well that her comrades don't even know. They're shocked when they find out. That she goes home is not a way of then caving in. It's a way of continuing to uphold some of the traditional values, because if you're going to make this is I don't know if this is going to extend all through history, but one of the ways you make an effective social statement is not by saying to hell with everything that's come before it. It is to say, hang on a second, where are you judging all this from? What ground are you standing on? If that ground is gone, I'm still going to choose to go back and do this because it's my choice. And that could possibly be the most powerful statement in the poem, is I'm going back not because they're making me go back and be a good Confucian daughter, but because I want to. I have the option of being a bureaucrat in the civil administration or going home. I'm going to go home.
On this question of whether or not this is a feminist poem, can I suggest a compromise?
Go for it.
I think that maybe we can see it on the surface as accepting some form of traditional Confucian gender dynamic, while still underneath leaving the door open for this feminism that we would see later, those people who I talked about who cited Mulan as the example that they used to become Chinese feminist in the 20th century. Yeah, so those women are able to cite this, even though I don't necessarily think that this is a feminist poem. It is feminist in that it challenges the rhetoric of Confucian orthodoxy.
And it gives the main character a choice. The Khan gives her a choice. I don't know of too many other ancient stories or even pre-modern stories in which the woman has a choice. It is literally up to her. And granted, we're looking at a very short piece. There could be if this was in fact a real thing, there could have been many reasons that went into this. But in this presentation, it's up to her.
So let me ask you something. Do you think that, so we don't know whether or not the Khan, the emperor who's offering her this position, knows whether or not Mulan is a woman. Do you think that if he did know for certain that Mulan was a woman, that he would still be offering her this position? Do you think she would still have that choice in that case?
Don't know. I really don't know. And, of course, we could also then ask, if he wasn't giving her the choice, would she still choose to go home? They may have forced her to go home. But that's a detail that we can't know because it's not there. But, I mean, it involves a whole host of motivations. She does choose to go home, but her parting words, I mean, she could have just left. Yep, I'm a woman. Bye, I'm going home now. But she leaves them with a parting thought, which shows that she's aware of the power dynamics. She's aware of how arbitrary they are, at least in this context. And she wants people to know she knows they're arbitrary. So the fact that she leaves in this fashion is what, for me, makes the poem more of a feminist poem, because she's affirming a woman's right to decide for herself what she's going to do with her life. And it challenges her male counterparts to deal with the fact that they didn't know she was a woman and they served happily alongside of her.
I'm still not convinced, Rob. I'm sorry. I think that you've made some inroads into my understanding of this poem. You have convinced me some, but not completely. I would still suggest that this is maybe a kind of compromise poem where it presents this traditional Confucian gender dynamics, but allows a space that eventually people are able to question and go, well, wait a second. And, 700 or 800 years later, Chinese feminism can sort of start to blossom using this poem. But I don't know if that necessarily makes it a feminist poem for me.
I think you're wrong, and I'm going to stop there.
Okay.
But I will also point out, because we didn't point out earlier, there is no Eddie Murphy dragon character in this poem.
That's really too bad.
I was waiting for the Eddie Murphy dragon character, and it wasn't there, and that's very sad to me.
It's disappointing.
It is very disappointing.
But that's why Disney and America makes every other country's things better.
We add characters that people really wanted to have. Talking dragon character is what everyone has always wanted.
Can I ask you?
Yes.
Could America be as great as it is without Eddie Murphy?
I think that could serve as a really interesting podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think certainly the 1980s would have been a bottomless hell without him, so I don't know.
I'll have to say, I think the 1980s were a bottomless hell.
Even with him. And on that note,
I think we should call it quits.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.